Procedural fidelity is actually what most of us think about when we think about fidelity. It's the things that you need to do. Only in child-parent psychotherapy, we don't have procedures for each session, because when you work with little kids, it's really hard to say, let's do this and this and this, because they have their very own agendas. In child-parent psychotherapy, we have 3 phases of treatment. The foundational phase, where we do our assessments and we engage families, the core intervention phase, and the closing phase. I want to share a metaphor so that we can think together for why these procedures are important. Often when we're on consult calls, therapists will ask us questions. They'll say, we're having a lot of problems during the core intervention phase because the parent doesn't seem to be on board. And what I often think about is that treatment is a little bit like a journey. And sometimes, if we think about it, you're in the middle of a river with a parent, and you're saying, we're having problems right now. The journey is really rocky. Things aren't going well. And my question to people is, how did you get in the boat with the caregiver? So if we rewind and go back to the riverbank and say, what were your agreements? What did you learn? How did you step in? Those are our procedures, and if you get into the boat well, you'll find that you have fewer problems as you get into the middle of the river. In the foundational phase, session 1, we're typically doing a meeting with the caregiver where we're doing an intake, taking a developmental history. Session 2 is often a dyadic observation session. We want to get a sense of how the caregiver and child interact and play together. Session 3 is focused on the child's trauma history and trauma symptoms. And session 4 is focused on the caregiver's history and caregiver symptoms. So while we've given you this flow chart, we also want you to think flexibly about what you need to do in your agency. We understand that sometimes in some agencies, the child must be present for some of the early sessions. And so that might mean that you do the dyadic observation session earlier, or that you do some other aspect. These are all acceptable variations within procedural fidelity. When you're doing the assessments, when you're doing some of the foundational phase assessments, such as getting the child's trauma history or the caregiver's trauma history, you'll see that it goes much smoother and helps you later if you're able to meet alone with the caregiver. So again, throughout the course of your training, you'll be thinking with your trainer about how do you integrate these CPP procedures with what your agency and your system ask of you. After you've completed all of the procedures in the foundational phase, you'll see that the next procedure is that you'll have a feedback session. Part of our procedures for the feedback session is that you prepare for that session with your clinical supervisor, that you think through all of the material that you've learned, you think about your case formulation, and then you think about how you might dialogue with the caregiver about this. Then you meet with the caregiver, and that part of that feedback session is to think about how you'll introduce the child into child-parent psychotherapy treatment. And our basic procedure for the core intervention phase is that you'll do the child-parent psychotherapy triangle with the child. Finally, as you get to the closing phase, we again have procedures. You'll want to meet with the caregiver again alone. You'll want to be doing some kind of assessment so that you can think with the caregiver about what's changed, and then you'll plan the ending with the caregiver. Our stance is that we hold other fidelity strands in mind as we follow procedures. So remember, we reflect, we follow affect, we help reconnect, and we strengthen relationships, and we connect history, including trauma history, to current functioning. Our underlying principles are that assessment leads to better understanding and greater clarity for both the therapist and the family, and that CPP fidelity is guided by reflection, not rigid adherence to what might be perceived as perfection.